Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Science and Sports. Before we jump in, if you're into performance, rehab, and applied sports science, make sure to follow the podcast on Spotify and connect with me on Instagram at science underscore in underscore sports underscore for more content, clips, and behind the scenes insights. I'm your host, Simon Heidenreich, and today we're talking about one of the most critical phases in any athlete's journey: the return to competition. It's not just about being pain free, it's about being fully game ready. Back with me today is Dominik Theodorou, athletic trainer at Rasta Vechta. After our great talk on load monitoring, we're now digging into how pro teams manage the return to play process. From rehab to readiness, let's dive in. This podcast is presented by Like Me, your partner for social media and online marketing from Weiden, and Praxis im Salzhaus, your contact for physiotherapy and health in Altenstadt.
Dom, welcome back for your second time here on my podcast. Thanks for joining me. Today we have a different topic than last time. Today I want to talk to you about the return to competition programs.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Simon, for having me as a guest the second time. I hope I can be of help today.
For sure, for sure. The reason why I wanted to talk to you again is like we mentioned it at the end of our first episode together, the importance and the role of a return to competition program. Can you share some personal experiences from you working with a return to competition program?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's now season 10 for me, being a performance coach in professional basketball. And obviously, you always have to deal with injured players. And throughout the years, I, developed some sort of ways of going about that. But especially throughout the last 2 years, I developed some sort of a framework. And this framework is something we now guide our return to competition processes with. So, I mean, in general, maybe return to competition for me, during this phase, you're trying to expedite the recovery process of a player while simultaneously minimizing the likelihood of re-injury. And in professional sports, of course, time is always of the essence, and ideally, we want to get players back as quickly as possible, which is sometimes tricky, of course, and involves risks.
Yeah.
So, when I'm now speaking of this framework, I mean the first, like, it was basically 2 years ago. There was a pretty sad incident. We and you will probably know how I felt after that happened. We signed a player, one of our starting big men, and he was at the end of our screening before the start of preseason. And it was literally the last test he had to go through from our preseason screening, and this was a 20-meter sprint. And the guys always had to go through 2 trials, and he did the first trial, everything was good, and then he did the second one. And really, at the end of the 20 meters, you see him like holding his high hip. And yeah, he got injured doing that test. And in the end, it turned out that he had a partial rupture of the proximal, like, musculotendinous junction of the rectus femoris in his thigh. And I was sitting there on the side, the way he looked when he started holding his thigh, that didn't look good. And I couldn't sleep for the next 2 weeks, especially after I found out like what really happened after talking to our medical team, and in the end, he missed 59 days, so 8.5 weeks. He missed in total 32 team practices, and he missed 11 games like preseason and regular season games combined. And he never had a muscle injury before that. So, and then I was standing there. Yeah, and now I had to find out how to bring this guy back from injury. And this was, I think for me, this was the biggest case that I had. I mean, touch wood, I never had like an ACL tear or something like this. And then I was standing there. I had zero experience with this type of injury. I never had that before. So it's basically the high hip rectus femoris kind of area. I couldn't really find anything in the literature. It was really tough to find. And I had no baseline values from our preseason screening because this structure I did not really test. And for me, it was very, very tough to quantify and to quantify the progress of the injured tissue throughout this time frame. Yeah, but I still, I had this guy now, and I had to start working with him. So and now I come to our return to competition framework. I usually put this in 3 phases. And the first phase is the acute phase after the injury. So I call this the off-court return to competition. And during the off-court return to competition, what I usually do, as quickly as possible, the injured players go back to training. Training off-court involves like strength training and conditioning, like on an eco bike, for example. And usually what I do then, I come up with a schedule for 5 to 6 strength training sessions per week, combined with 5 to 6 conditioning sessions on a stationary bike, if it's possible, if it doesn't provoke any pain. And he gets also physical therapy from our physical therapist almost every day. And the goal for this phase is, first of all, of course, the local strengthening of the injured tissue, and always within the constraints of the injury. So if something hurts, then I rather stay away from it. Although I tell the guys always, if in this case we had to target the high hip. In this case, if the pain is below a 3 on a scale from 1 to 10, I always tell the guys this is okay. If it goes to 4 or 5, then I try to find something else. So this is for me the first thing, like the local strengthening of the injured tissue. But on the other hand, it's also the global strengthening of the rest of the body, because if one leg is injured, you have the other leg you can work on, and you have the whole, like you can work on upper body stuff, of course.
Yeah, for sure.
So in general, my basic idea for this phase is as much training as possible in the weight room and on the bike, to hopefully maintain acute and chronic training load as best as possible. And at the end of this stage, when I think, or when the player and me, we are like, okay, I think now we can go maybe start doing stuff on court, then the player usually gets an examination of our team doctor. And the team doctor gives me then his idea on how he thinks the player looks. And of course, previously, the player ideally goes to strength tests of the local tissue, of the injured tissue. Usually what I do there, I mean, in this case, I have to admit, it was really, really tough to isolate that structure because it was the high hip. I tried it with like hip flexion from bent knee position with a straight leg and stuff like this. But it was really hard. It was not easy. If it was let's say an adductor injury or an hamstring injury, I mean, muscle tests are obviously a lot easier than that.
Yeah.
But in the end, I found a way to somehow isolate the structure, and throughout time, the structure actually felt better. And that was the time when I went to our team doctor and asked him for an examination to clear phase 1, the off-court return to competition, before we go into phase 2. Does that make sense? Was that easy to understand?
It is easy to understand, yes.
Okay. So if you don't mind, I would now go to phase 2.
Yes, please go ahead.
Because the phase 2 is basically the off-court, the phase 1 stays the same. So the player will continue to do his strength training and will continue to do his conditioning. But now we add basketball training to that. So phase 2 is basically an extension of phase 1. So we actually go on the court. And when I say we go on the court, it's the player and me. Because what I want is, I progressively want to improve the sport specific, the basketball capacity. But I need to do that always within the constraints of the injury. So what that means is, and here our load monitoring tool comes into play, which I have talked about in the previous episode. So usually I have historical data from a player. Yeah, and I said in the previous episode that usually game day -3 is the highest intensity day of our practices. So if I'm in the possession of training load data from game day -3 practices, then I have a good idea of what the mechanical load is that a player needs to go through on game day -3. So if I know that, I basically have a target zone that I want to reach within my individual one-on-one training on the court. That basically means, let's assume the goal is a movement of 250. When we are in zone 2, we obviously don't go right away to 250, because that's probably not what the player is capable of. And you have to start slowly in order to build that up. So if I know the goal is a movement load of 250, I would start probably somewhere of 75 or 100 on the court up until we reach that mark. Yeah. And when I do that training with him, everything is high control. So it's nothing where the player has to react on things because first of all I have to find out how the player deals with the load on the court anyway. So what I would do is the first training session would probably spin around a movement load of 75 and 100, and on the next day I would ask the player how the body coped with it, and if he gives me a positive feedback and tells me everything is fine, then I slowly at the quantity of training load. So then on the next session, I would probably go to a 125. And this way, I slowly add up the practice exposure of the player. So getting him used to the mechanical loads on a basketball court again. And I think I said that earlier. I do that up until I reach the goal that I previously set. So in order to give him time to adjust again. But this is not the end of phase 2. Let's say I did that with the player, like in a one-on-one session. I completed 2 of these practices on consecutive days, and the player keeps telling me, hey, Dom, I feel good. Then I would add an assistant coach. Because what the addition of an assistant coach does, I mean, the assistant coach knows basketball better than I do. The assistant coach knows the tactical and technical demand for that specific player better than I do. So with the help of the assistant coach, what we can do, we can slowly start incorporating more chaos into the individual workouts. So in the end, the player gets like even a more specific basketball training. And then with the addition of this assistant coach and me still being around, we can also improve the density of these individual sessions. And again, the good thing is, by knowing previous, like, historical data, previous workloads from his previous practice sessions before he got injured, we just have a better idea of the overall, let's say, quantity of training that we need to get the player through in order to at least, slowly adapt him again to the demands of basketball practice. And this is a little bit the idea behind this phase 2. And if the player, let's say, went through phase 2, he finished 2 practice sessions with me. He finished 2 practice sessions with me and the assistant coach. Then we would give him again to our team doctor for an examination. And if the team doctor also agrees, then we would clear him for phase 3. And the phase 3 for us is the progressive reintegration into team practice. So that basically means we don't throw him right away into team practice. We would slowly progress that. So, for example, if he team practice number 1 would probably be only a practice with 1 contact drill, and this contact drill would be only in the half court. In the second team practice, we would go 2 contact drills, ideally both in the half court. In the third practice, we would go 3 contact drills, one full court, 2 half courts. And in team practice number 4, we would then, provided that his feedback is always positive, we would then let him do the whole practice.
Okay. So everything builds on top of each other. But what happens, for example, in your scenario now, that you progressively implement into the team practice, and the player tells you in day 4 that it's too much.
Yeah.
Do you go back a day?
Yeah.
Or do you go back even further?
No, what we do is, that's a very good question. So this is what I mean. I mean, now what I explained to you, these are all ideal scenarios, but that rarely happens. So if, let's say, if we are in phase 2 and we go through practice 3 and our goal is a movement load of 150, but he comes in the next day and tells me, oh man, no, it doesn't really feel good. It feels worse. So then then we have to make a decision, of course. And that's when we obviously, when I communicate with our physical therapist, and it depends then. Maybe we take a step back in order to take a step forward on the next day. If it's not as bad, then we maybe repeat what we did the previous day. So this is all, there's no ideal solution. You got to be flexible in these situations.
Yeah, for sure.
And the thing that I haven't really mentioned yet, what I have found out when you do these one-on-one sessions, compared to basketball practices, these one-on-one sessions are very demanding in terms of the internal demands. So based on heart rate, the trim scores are always very high. And also the time spent in higher heart rate zones is very high. And also the epoch peak values are sometimes much higher than in team practices. But this is because, in a one-on-one setting, the player doesn't really get a break. There's not that much explaining happening. So the player is basically forced to go and go and go, because he's the only guy that does something. So what I've found out over the years is that the internal demands in these individual practices are, I would even say, much higher than team practices. Depends on the team practice, of course. But what is a little lower is, of course, the mechanical demand. So his movements, basically. Because I compared the individual practices to team practices, and the peak outputs that the player has to do in team practice are much higher than what he needs to do in individual practices. But that, for me, also makes sense, because if you have somebody in front of you that you want to beat off the dribble, you will probably always be more explosive compared to having nobody in front of you, just going for a layup. Yeah, that makes sense to me. But that brings me to another point. Whenever we are in phase 3, so the reintegration into team practices, we always try to let the player go through only one basketball practice of the day. So, for example, if the team has weights and individuals in the morning and team practice in the evening, the particular player who is in phase 3 would do the weights in the morning, but would not do the individuals, because we know the level of intensity in terms of his movements will be much higher than what he was compared to in the individual practices. That's why we would like to leave it at one basketball practice per day. And this is also like throughout the whole return to competition process, is only one basketball practice per day. If that makes sense.
Gotcha.
There was now a lot of information.
It was definitely a lot of information, but it was clear for me to understand it. But there are a couple of things I want to ask you a little bit more in depth about it.
Yeah.
First of which would be, you said you'll talk to an assistant coach and you add him to your phase 2 work.
Yeah.
So you're in the off-court return to competition and you add him to have a look on the sport-specific elements of basketball, for example.
Yeah.
How is the collaboration then in total between you, the medical staff, coaches, the physiotherapists, and also the players? How do you communicate with them in the whole process?
I mean, the good thing is I always work well together with our physical therapist, because if he has time, he always also watches the sessions. And the good thing about this framework is, because I explained it to our coaches, I explained the 3 phases to them, and I also explained what the 3 phases mean. And now I go to the head coach and I can tell him, okay, our goal for phase 2 with me, we want to get him to 250. Right now he is at 200, so he needs 1 more days to clear that. After that, if time allows, like I said earlier, the addition of the assistant coach in these on-court during phase 2 is in my mind pretty important. But if you don't have time, if you need the player back sooner, and if there is an important game coming up, then that's what professional sport is. Then you might take some risks. Obviously, we won't take big risks, but if it's very important, then like if we are in phase 3, for example, and we want him to go to 2 more practices before clearing the whole practice, sometimes we don't get to that, and then we take a calculated risk. But usually the communication is actually pretty clear. And the good thing of when you have a system like this, at least everybody is on the same page and everybody knows. And if the player gives us a bad feedback one day, then we got to see what we do. Maybe we take a step back. Maybe we also let him rest for one day and go back the next day. This always depends.
You just said it nicely that sometimes there is the case that a player has to come back quicker for an important game, for example. How do you manage the player's expectations to come back? Maybe he wants to have 1 or 2 days more to recover and be ready again. And sometimes, like you said, you have the external pressure from, I don't know, the coaching team, from big sponsors, from the management team. How do you handle that? How do you manage it so every side is good with the outcome?
Yeah, I mean, I gotta say, if the player doesn't feel confident, let's say the game is in 2 days and we're at the start of phase 3, where we slowly put him back, reintegrate him into team practices. And my head coach asked me, hey, can he play? And then we would speak to the player if we really think it's necessary, because that's the most important thing. If the player doesn't feel good enough, then we would not force him to play, of course. but if it's a different scenario, if let's say if the player wants to play, but we are not really, we haven't really completed our return to competition framework, and the game is important. Yeah, I mean, then we would speak, within our coaching staff and medical staff, and we would make a decision then.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's how it goes. We're not going to force a player to play if he doesn't want to play.
Yeah.
But if a player feels good and wants to play, but hasn't really passed the return to competition framework, yeah, then we speak. And this is professional sports.
Obviously.
In the end, I think it's risk management. That's all you do, basically.
Yeah, I mean, if a player doesn't want to play yet, maybe it's part of the confidence that he doesn't have yet, and a fear of re-injury, and that would be obviously the worst case for every part of it.
Yeah, of course.
Without knowing your specific testing battery, I guess, or I know that you probably fulfill like the unique demands of the sport of basketball. In which phase of a return to competition program do you then start to re-implement those demands, the sport specific parts of basketball, like the high intense jumps, the different actions that take place on the court in a game? When do you then implement them so they are back for game shape?
I mean, yeah, this is part of phase 2. So because this is the phase where we bring the player back on the court, but we gradually build that up, of course. So in the beginning, it might be a lot of stationary stuff where we only do layups, or we just do spot up shooting, where we only do linear movements, like only half court drills in a one-on-one setting I'm speaking about now. Yeah. So in this setting, we have low accelerations and decelerations. The movements are probably more scripted. There's obviously no contact. And there's, a slow transition from walking to jogging to running. But this is all what I control in that phase. So, and with time, and if everything goes well, the player feels better. And then we can also start increasing the demands. So let's say we're in the middle of phase 2, and he has passed all of the topics I just talked about. Then I would progressively put him into, for example, I would increase some tempo runs, where he goes from baseline to midline, back to baseline, back to the opposing baseline and back, and we would slowly increase the running speed that he's running with, and I would control that with overall seconds for a tempo run, for example. We would increase the change of direction tasks from 45 degrees to 180 degrees, stuff like that. But this is all stuff that I take care of before I would want the player to work with me and the assistant coach, because I want to check all these boxes before. If that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense for sure. What I'm still interested in, after you're done with all your 3 phases, you said in your example that your player, the big man, got injured in the last test. He went through all the different phases. Does he have to do a test before he's back and cleared to play again?
Yeah, the thing is with him, he got injured in the sprint test. Yeah, I said that, and I usually you would say, he needs to go through this. I decided not to, because I simply didn't want to put him in that position again.
Yeah.
Because I was just too scared. And I also asked him, and he was like, nah, let's maybe skip that. And of course, I was nervous when he stepped on the court again after, in phase 3, when we started slowly reintegrating him into the team practices. After 8.5 weeks spending time with him, he going back to practice, I was, legitimately nervous, and I would say even scared that, of course, he would re-injure something. But I totally agree with you. I mean, in this particular example, it was very hard to do a retest because I didn't really have like a test in the beginning for that structure, if you know what I mean. You
Yeah.
know, I do tests for the groin, for example. If then I have a player with a groin injury, I can definitely better compare. But this example was such an intricate one, because I really had issues to, let's say, compare any test results to my screenings. And this is, speaking of screenings, I don't know what you think, but for me, the screening is not necessarily for me about performance. It's more about baseline reference values. So the screening for me is, I want to get reference values so that if in the event of an injury, I can just compare things better. That's why we do, in basketball, you a lot of times have wrists or hand injuries. That's why we do grip strength and stuff like that. Just that we have a better measure in case something happens.
Is your way of the working through the framework injury specific, or can you just adjust it from injury to injury? Not 100% obviously the same, but is it like the name suggests, a framework that you can build on with different injuries?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I had that with an ankle injury, with the severe ankle injury where a player was out 5 weeks. And again, it depends on the type of the injury. If it's just, let's say, a small injury where a player only, misses a week or two, then he doesn't need to go through the whole framework, of course. And that's what I meant earlier. You got to be flexible with these things, huh?
You have to,
but if it's
it
like a
different
hamstring
from-
strain, for example,
Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, if you have a hamstring strain, for example, and the player is out 4 weeks, then you can, slowly build him up again. I think you have to anyway, because I think I mentioned earlier, everything. This is also a very important parameter that I still check. I check the acute training load. The acute training load is like the load basically of the last 7 days.
Mhm.
And my goal doing return to competition is that I want to, bring up the acute training load to previous levels before the injury, because then I know that the overall amount of training load is similar to the, to the time where he wasn't injured before. This is tough to do doing return to competition, but you can get very close if you really expose him to a lot of training. Of course, it needs to be built up in a smart way. It's not that you hammer in training load every day. You have to of course always take the injured structure into consideration and his feedback into consideration, of course. But this is very important to me, because you don't want the acute and also not the chronic load to drop like a lot. Ideally you would like to prevent that, because that basically means, that he is also, that he stays in a reasonable, like, I don't want to say shape, but in the end it is what it is. So you just want to keep these training loads as high as you possibly can during return to competition.
Yeah. What are the most common injuries in basketball?
I have ankle injuries. I think that's the most. And then you have a lot, like, jumper's knee, patella tendonitis, these kind of things. They are very common. And the groin is, groin, you have hands, stuff like that. Sometimes hamstring strains also happen, yeah. But
Is it-
for sure, it's ankle joint and knee.
If you think about the different positions in basketball, guards and the big men, let's put it in those two categories. Are injuries occurring more, or the same injuries more, in a specific group?
Tough to say. Don't have a real spot-on answer for this.
Okay. Yeah, it's probably, if you can read the data from the reports over the league, maybe you get an insight on that. But I was just curious, because it could be that some big men have more of the same injury, and maybe the guards have a little bit a bias towards something. But do you then also adjust the framework, the programming into the return to competition based on different positions as well?
Yeah, I mean, let's say the way I individualize it is always based on their previous or on their historical training data. I want to bring some, because everybody has a different acute training load. Everybody has different, let's say, training loads in terms of their highest practice day. So maybe a center, with the center, I don't have to go to 250. Maybe with him, I only have to go to 180 because he doesn't really, have a lot of movement load anyway, because he simply doesn't move as much. So in that way, I'm speaking here of the specific demands, of the specific basketball demands. In that way, I always individualize the return to competition, of course.
Okay. You mentioned earlier, before we sign off for this episode, that you use a monitoring system doing your work with the return to competition framework you just mentioned. Can you tell me a little bit about how you work with it and how important it is for you in your work into or for getting the players into game shape again?
Yeah, it's a little bit like I said previously, because through the individual work on the court, you can improve their physiological system a lot, because they are just meant to do so much more. And for me, it's also good when you communicate to players. I think it's very valuable, because you can tell the players up front what their goal is during return to competition. Yeah. So you can basically bring them up. You can actually educate them a little bit also on why we use the system and why it does make a lot of sense to look at that. And they grasp the idea actually pretty fast. So the guy I was working with, from my example, at some point he just adopted my terminology. He just came in and was like, "Hey, Dom, today is movement load. What do you want to go to? 180?" It's like, yeah, exactly. So, I pretty much believe that it also gives them, let's say, some sort of motivation, maybe, but you know what I mean, right?
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Let's say, maybe it sort of also boosts the athlete's commitment to, to return to competition. I would like to believe so, that it helps definitely in communicating what we are trying to go towards on a daily basis. Not sure if that answered the question.
It did, yes. I just want to say something to it. It's also always the thing about the respect from the players to you and back. And if you have a valid plan for them and they see that it works, you have the trust and they see you have the knowledge for that. And then it's like the same with the communication with the staff or with the coaching team. It makes life so much easier. And then you have guys who are willing to work with you and they know that they can trust you. And the same thing goes a long way, I think.
Yeah.
Dom, before we sign off, where can people find more about your work, your job at Rasta Vechta, and maybe you have also a point about your monitoring system as well?
You are relating now to the blog posts, I assume?
Yes.
Yeah, since when I started using the monitoring system, I was actually browsing the internet. I was looking in the internet for articles that would help me getting started using the first beat system. But to be honest, I couldn't really find much. And that's why at some point, because I was speaking to First Beat a lot, they asked me if I would be willing to do a webinar with them, and I was like, "Ooh, okay, yeah, sure, let's do it." And I did a webinar with them, and it was a great experience. I really liked it because I got to learn a ton. Because I think whenever you prepare a presentation or talk about your stuff, I think that's the best way of learning yourself. But then they asked me if I wanted to write a blog post. And then I was like, okay, I've never done this before, but I just started doing it. And to be honest, I loved it even more because there you have time to really put your thoughts on paper. And
Yeah,
this is for me almost, I would say, the best way of learning. Yeah, because like I just said, you really have to think twice what you put on paper and what you maybe don't put on paper.
for sure.
Yeah, and I've written now a few blog posts, and they are online. If you just have to Google my name and Firstbeat, then you find them. If you're interested, and if you really have questions, please let me know. I'm happy to talk about all this.
Yeah, if there are any questions, please text me, text Dom, write some in the comments, and I will link your blog post in the description, also with some socials from you,
Perfect.
if you want that. And yeah, thanks so much for your time. It was a pleasure talking to you again.
Thank you. Yeah, my likewise. Do you mind? I have some clothing thoughts because I think some things I didn't mention. In terms of like return to competition in general.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to say, I think in general, if you monitor during return to competition, is always better for navigation. Yeah, you can just navigate the process of return to competition much better. And if you have a plan in mind, that will always lead to better transparency. And also, like we just talked about, better communication with the coaching staff but also with the player. And if you happen to have the chance to integrate the player into return to competition process, or if you just, I don't know, if you give him milestones or something, that will probably boost the athlete's commitment. I would like to think though. And if it boosts the athlete's commitment to rehabilitation, maybe this also, fosters a sense of accomplishment. But in the end, you always have to take calculated risks. That's how it is in professional sports. And in general, the goal for return to competition should always be that you build up training loads systematically. I think that's very important. And in the end, it's nice to have a framework, but it's only a framework.
Yeah. First thing, don't rush it. Second thing, you have to be flexible, like you said.
Exactly.
Nothing more to add from my side.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much having me a second time.
Yeah, I would love to have you a third time coming up soon.
If you have a topic, let me know.
I will. It was nice talking to you again. And yeah, I wish you all the best. Thanks for your time.
Likewise. Have a good day.
You too. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to the show. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to follow the podcast, leave a rating or comment, and share it with someone who loves sports science. And for more content, follow me on Instagram at science_in_sports_. See you in the next episode.